What if the most famous laugh in the history of rock, the wild and unhinged laughter that erupts out of the darkness on Dark Side of the Moon and chills everyone who hears it for the first time, was not a clever studio effect at all, but the actual voice of a real man. A man who was not in the band, a man the album itself was quietly describing, and a man who would be dead of a heroin overdose within 3 years of the record's release. That is not a framing invented to disturb you. It is, as closely as the surviving record allows, the truth. And it is one of the strangest and saddest facts buried inside the best-selling catalog of the band's history. Dark Side of the Moon is an album about the forces that grind a human being down. Time and money and pressure and madness. And somewhere in its grooves, it captured the laughter of a man who was, at that very moment, beginning to fall into one of the abysses it maps. This is the story of that laugh, and of the man it belonged to, and of the quiet prophecy that nobody recognized while the tape was rolling. To understand the laugh, you have to understand who was actually in the room when Pink Floyd made this album. Because the popular image of a band as 4 musicians sealed away from the world is almost always a fiction. A touring band of that era was a small traveling society, and at the center of that society, doing the invisible work that lets the famous people walk on stage, was the road manager. For Pink Floyd, that man was Peter Watts. He was not a songwriter, not a player, not a face on the album cover. He was the person who made the machine run, who solved the 1,000 daily problems that never reach the audience. The kind of essential figure whose name vanishes from history precisely because he did his job well enough that nobody had to think about him. He was part of the family. He was in the building. And when the band, during the making of Dark Side, went looking for human voices to thread through the album, fragments of real speech and real sound to make the record feel inhabited by actual people rather than by abstractions, Peter Watts was one of the people they reached for. The method itself tells you something about what kind of album this was trying to be. Pink Floyd did not write scripts for these voices. They took a set of cards with questions printed on them. Questions about violence, about madness, about death, about the last time the person had been afraid, and they handed them to people around the studio, staff and friends, and whoever happened to be present, and recorded the answers. The idea was to catch something unguarded, something true, the texture of real human beings responding to the largest questions without time to perform an answer. Most of what they captured was speech. But from Peter Watts, they captured something that was not speech at all. They captured laughter, a great wild cascade of it. The kind of laughter that has stopped being an expression of amusement and become something closer to a force of nature, unhinged, uncontainable, slightly frightening. And the band knew exactly what they had. They placed it where it would do the most damage, weaving it through the album so that it surfaces in the territory of madness. The laughter rising out of the dark, like the voice of the very thing the record is most afraid of. Listen to where that laugh sits in the architecture of the album, and you understand why it works on the body before it works on the mind. Dark Side of the Moon is, among other things, a map of the ways a person comes apart. There is the track about time devouring you while you wait for your life to begin. There is the track about money corrupting everything it touches. And there is the long descent into madness that shadows the second half of the record. The fear that the mind itself is the thing that will betray you. Peter Watts's laughter is threaded into exactly that region. It is not a happy sound. It is the sound of someone who has crossed a line. Laughter with no joy left in it. And the band used it as the audible signature of insanity. The the noise that the abyss makes when it looks back at you. For millions of listeners, that laugh has become inseparable from the feeling of the album. The moment the carefully built calm cracks open and something uncontrolled pours through. It is one of the most recognized non-musical sounds in all of recorded music. And it came from a man who, within a few short years, would be consumed by the very kind of self-destruction the album was built to describe. Because here is the part of the story that turns a piece of studio trivia into something that should make you sit down. Peter Watts did not grow old. In the years after Dark Side of the Moon became a worldwide phenomenon, selling in numbers that almost no album in history had matched, the man whose laughter haunted it was falling into heroin addiction. And in 1976, 3 years after the release of the record his voice helped to immortalize, Peter Watts was found dead of an overdose. He was in his 30s. The album he had contributed to was still selling by the millions, still sitting on the charts, still being discovered by new listeners every week who would hear that laugh erupt from the dark and feel the hair rise on their arms, with no idea that the man who made it was already gone, killed by precisely the kind of force the record had spent 40 minutes anatomizing. The art that diagnosed the fall was carrying inside itself the recorded voice of a man who was falling. Nobody heard it as a prophecy at the time. It only becomes one in retrospect, which is the cruelest kind, the kind you can only read after it is too late to warn anyone. And the story has one more turn, the kind of turn that fiction would reject as too neat, but that life delivers without apology. Peter Watts left behind a young daughter. She was a small child when her father died, far too young to truly know him, left with the absence that the early death of a parent carves into a life. That daughter was Naomi Watts. She would grow up to become one of the most acclaimed actresses of her generation, a face known to hundreds of millions of people, nominated for the highest honors her art can offer. And almost none of the people who know her face have any idea that the wild laughter on one of the most famous albums ever made belongs to her father, a man she barely had the chance to know, a man whose most enduring trace in the world is 90 seconds of recorded laughter on a record about the things that destroy us. There is a daughter who became globally famous for being seen, and a father who is globally heard and almost never identified. And they are bound together by a record that neither of them chose as the place where their family story would be preserved. I want to be careful and honest here, because this is exactly the kind of story where myth tends to grow over the facts, and a thesis built on sand is worthless. The attribution of the laughter to Peter Watts is solid and well established. He was the band's road manager, he was part of the recording environment, and the laugh is his. What is murkier, and where you should be cautious if you go reading about this, is the precise attribution of every spoken line on the album. Because Dark Side of the Moon captured many voices, and the question of exactly who said which sentence has been debated for decades, with some lines confidently assigned and others still argued over. So I am resting this on what is firm, the laughter, and not overreaching into the disputed territory of the spoken fragments. The laugh is Peter Watts. The tragedy of his death is documented. The connection to Naomi Watts is real. Everything essential here stands on solid ground, and the parts that do not, I am leaving where they belong, in the realm of the uncertain. What stays with me when I put all of this together is the terrible, accidental honesty of it. Pink Floyd did not set out to record a dying man. They set out to make an album about the human condition under pressure, about the forces that wait for all of us. And in pursuit of that truth, they did something almost documentary. They pointed their microphones at the real people around them and asked them to be honest about fear and madness and death. And one of those real people gave them a laugh that turned out to be the most truthful thing on the record. Because it was not an actor performing madness or a musician evoking it. It was an actual human being whose own life was bending toward exactly the destruction the album was describing. The greatest art about the abyss is almost never made by people standing safely at its edge. It is made, knowingly or not, by people who are already leaning over it. And sometimes the proof of that is right there in the recording, hidden in plain sound, a laugh that everyone hears and almost no one understands. So the next time Dark Side of the Moon reaches the place where the laughter breaks loose, the moment the album stops being music and becomes something raw and more frightening, listen to it differently. You are not hearing a sound effect. You are hearing Peter Watts, road manager, family man, a person who made the whole machine run while the famous men stood in the light. A father who would be dead within 3 years of his own voice becoming immortal. Laughing the laugh that the world would come to associate with madness on the most successful album about madness ever made. The record outlived him by half a century, and counting. His daughter became one of the most visible people on earth. And his own great contribution to history is a sound that millions love. Without knowing it, is the voice of a man the album was, in its way, already mourning before it knew it had anything to mourn. If you want the rest of these hidden lives, the people at the edges of Pink Floyd, whose voices and hands shaped the records while their names stayed in the dark. That is the whole spine of my Pink Floyd dossier. And the link is waiting in the pinned comment, but the heart of it is in this one sound. So I will leave you the question the laugh has been asking, unheard, for 50 years. When an album about everything that destroys a human being captures the real laughter of a man who is about to be destroyed and presses it onto the best-selling record of its age, is that a sound effect? Or is it the only true prophecy on the album, the one no one was able to read until the man was already gone? Where art does not console, it autopsies.